Truth Espresso, episode 153.
Face it, we all would rather sleep in this morning. That's why God gave us espresso, to kickstart our zombified corpses into hyperdrive. And now, giving your mind and soul the morning shot of truth it craves. This is Truth Espresso with Daniel Minnick.
Well, hey there, this is Daniel Minnick, the host of the Truth Espresso podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and we are going to talk about New Year's resolutions. And as of this recording, it is not long before midnight New Year's Day, and this is the end of 2021 for us, but as you're listening to this, it will be 2022. So we are preparing for the new year, and we hope that this episode will help you prepare for the new year and every year after that. And I'd like to welcome my co-host, my sweet and beautiful wife and co-host Chelsea. And so thank you, sweetheart, for doing this with me again.
Yes, thank you, babe.
So ready to talk about some New Year's resolutions and really how we should think about New Year's resolutions from a Christian and biblical perspective.
Yeah, this sounds like a good topic.
Okay, and so when it comes to New Year's resolutions, we want to start by looking at some of the history, like why do people celebrate New Year's resolutions? And so we're going to get to the history of it, and then we want to look at some statistics about New Year's resolutions, you know, the old ideas of how many people, will actually make it versus keep it and so on. So we'll see just how accurate our thinking is on that according to survey statistics. Finally, with this topic, we want to address it from a biblical perspective, just how Christians should think about New Year's resolutions specifically, but also how we should resolve things according to the Bible and what we should focus on as Christians. And so, getting into history, I got this from cnet.com. We'll provide a link to this in the show notes, but sweetheart, are New Year's resolutions kind of a new thing? Is it something that's like 100 years old, or maybe even as long as 200 years old? The practice of making resolutions at the beginning of the year.
Well, since I kind of looked at the history, is it fair for me to answer that?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Is it more than 200 years?
Yes.
Okay.
I think it's closer to thousands.
Thousands. Whoa. So basically our practice of New Year's resolutions in some form or other has come from most of known history. Even to ancient cultures, there is some form of New Year's resolutions. And from the CNET article that I have, about 5,000 years ago, the ancient Egyptians started with New Year's celebrations. And in most of these cultures, they had the idea of appeasing the gods. And so they also recognize, every cycle, every, planting and harvest cycle, and then you had like the winter, where things had to die, and then you had new life beginning in the spring. These ancient cultures would basically try to deal with things with their own lives or with pledges that they would make for a better harvest or some kind of self-improvement, but the ancient Egyptians had New Year's celebrations. So, yeah, like new life beginning was a cause for celebration for the ancient Egyptians and probably pretty much anywhere else in the world. But according to this article, we trace New Year's resolutions, the history such, to at least 5,000 years ago.
Wow, that's amazing. I don't think I really thought about how far back this could have gone before looking into it.
Yeah, I was expecting something like a few hundred years, but yeah, so there's a long history to this current practice. But of course, I don't think the ancient Egyptians were making pledges to renew their gym membership or something like that. And so we move on to the next, unless you have anything that's okay, between 5,000 and 4,000 years. Yeah.
I only found for the 4,000 years,
Oh, yeah.
which I think you have too.
Yeah, the CNET article mentions about 4,000 years ago, we see that the ancient Babylonians pledged to the gods at the beginning of the year, which for them was kind of the beginning of spring, and I think that was the case pretty much with every culture before we had a modern calendar that was synchronized with the revolution of the earth around the sun. So New Year's revolutions, So the ancient Babylonians pledged to the gods at the beginning of the year, which was the beginning of the spring, to pay their debts. And this was a 12-day long celebration for the Babylonians. Now, that continues on to the present because some of their New Year's resolutions, even today, are like, I'm going to be better with my finances. I want to get out of debt. I resolve to pay off this credit card. So, yeah, you could trace that back to the ancient Babylonians in or at least around 2000 BC. But you're probably not pledging it to some Babylonian god. But you have anything else about the Babylonians, babe?
Yeah, I saw it too that they would pledge to pay off debts and then also to return any borrowed items.
Oh, yeah.
And that they thought in doing those two things that they would gain favor from the gods, that they would be blessed. And if they didn't follow through with their promises to pay off the debt and return items, that they would actually be cursed that next year. So it was interesting that they saw like both, okay, the benefit of doing that, they could see more prosperous times that next year, and if they failed, that they could potentially be cursed. Because I think a lot of times now we are only looking at, okay, what's the benefit of it? We don't think of, okay, if we fail, what's the downside?
Yeah, today with our New Year's resolutions, it's just kind of like self-motivation, and it might fall by the wayside. But the Babylonians took their New Year's resolutions a little more seriously, because they felt like the gods might punish them if they don't keep them. Yeah. And so we move on to about 3,000 years ago. So we're counting by thousands basically here. About 3,000 years ago, we can move on to the east to China. And so in ancient China, I think it was the Shang Dynasty, if I remember from the CNET article. This is really where the Chinese New Year came from. And even back 3,000 years ago, they had costumes and decorations and basically a form of like the floats that we'd have in parades. And so I think they've probably been having those kinds of dragon type costumes or floats for, several thousand years here. Yeah, and then they also were trying to ward off, like try to appease and ward off the curses of a god that actually meant year. And so, yeah, they're trying to appease the year god with their pledges. Do you have anything else for China, babe? Or...
I didn't.
Yeah, okay. So that's China and the Chinese New Year, which is still celebrated today. And the Chinese New Year is not January 1st. It's later. I forget what it is. I don't have it in my notes, but we have friends that know what the Chinese New Year is. And do you have anything between 3,000 and 2,000 years ago, babe? Nope. Okay. Do you have anything for 2,000 years ago?
The Romans?
Oh, yeah. Do you have any? Want to talk about Romans, and then I'll follow up with anything I have here?
Sure. So the Romans were kind of interesting too in kind of how we got the name for January, because they would offer sacrifices to a god named Janus, which was a two-faced god. One face they thought looked back into the past, and the other face would be looking forward into the future. And that's where we get our word January from. And they would make promises to this god to be good in the coming year. And if they, again, kept their promises, then they would be blessed or have more prosperity. And if they didn't keep their promises, then they would be condemned by the god.
Yeah, and at this time, I think it was 46 BC that Julius Caesar changed the calendar, like, because the calendar was based on like a kind of a spring to spring type thing. And the calendars weren't as very accurate, but Julius Caesar was trying to make a more accurate calendar that more accurately reflected the full length of the seasons, you know, closer to the sun, how long it takes the earth to go around the sun. So we have the Julian calendar, Julius Caesar. And yeah, you mentioned, Suyar, that people made offerings to the god Janus, who was the god of doorways, arches, and new beginnings. And so they were hoping for blessings from the god Janus, who looks back and looks forward. And yeah, so he's the god of what you could see behind you, what you see ahead, going through a doorway or something like that. Now, I move forward. Do you have anything for 1,000 years ago? Well, I have something for about 500 years ago. In the 1570s, Pope Gregory the 13th. Wow, there's a lot of Pope Gregories. I mean, I know of Pope Gregory the Great, you know, the first one, who was, trying to think, he was not long after the Council of Chalcedon. Maybe I'm trying to remember from my early church history, but wow, there's a lot of Pope Gregories. So Pope Gregory the 13th switched the calendar from the Julian calendar set up by Julius Caesar to the Gregorian calendar, and this was to adjust some slight inaccuracies that ended up with, like, I think there is like an 11-minute issue with the years, but Julius Caesar in Rome made the biggest change. He ended up with a long year, like I think it was 500 some days, but he was trying to adjust the calendar, and he got it a lot more accurate than it was before, because they're dealing with over time. You know, you pretty much end up with the summer, you know, at the beginning of the year, something like that, you know, and so he's trying to make something that was more accurate for the length of the year, but it still wasn't quite accurate as a calendar as we have with the Gregorian calendar today, adjusting leap years and stuff. So Julius Caesar made it more accurate, and then Gregory made it even, you know, slightly more accurate. And I think that might have, I'm trying to remember, that did have to adjust that year some to make that happen, but not making a 500 some day year like Julius Caesar did. But yeah, that's an incident in church history related to changing the new year, which would modify when people would make New Year's resolutions. And yeah, so sweetheart, do you have more after this about New Year's resolutions in more recent history?
Yes, so I had one more timeline here to add to our discussion. In 1740, John Wesley established what was called the Covenant Renewal Service, or also known as the Watch Night Services. And this was a time that Christians would get together and sing hymns and read scriptures. And this was to kind of contrast what a lot of the more secular people were doing with late night celebrations and rivalries and drunkenness. So the Christians wanted to try and come together and just kind of be watchful during the nights. And we see that this tradition is carried on through modern times, and especially in some of the African American communities where they still sing hymns and read scriptures and commit to New Year resolutions on New Year's Eve, which I think is really cool. I kind of wish we saw more of that. But
kind of like a Christian version of it type of thing.
Yeah, just like a church service on New Year's Eve, like going later into the evening, just like okay, we're going to bring in the new year singing praises and reading scriptures. Like, I don't know. I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah, sounds like a way to make the new year more of a, Christian focused thing rather than today where you have a lot of people getting drunk, watching a ball drop, and getting ready to start the new year with a hangover, mixed in with their resolutions. Like, okay, after you get over your hangover and slump back to work, okay, now I'm going to start some resolutions. Yeah, and so that's the history of New Year's resolutions that we kind of know. There's some modern Christian involvement with it. Historically, a longer time ago, it was more of a pagan religious type thing, which would reflect a lot of the cultures. There is a lot of importance with, agricultural ancient cultures because their livelihoods depended on the harvest cycle. And so there's a lot of superstition around that too. And yeah, but people would resolve each year to try to make that year good for their own sakes. But now in Western culture, we have New Year's resolutions that are more like secular with a focus on individual self-improvement, and it seems like there's little thought of outside accountability. So where in ancient cultures there was the fear that the gods might punish them if they didn't keep it, now it's more like frivolous, hopeful, types of resolves that we'll see when we look at some of the statistics just how successful people might be.
So what are some of the top resolutions that you found when you were researching this out, Sudie?
Well, let's see. So I looked at an article on discoverhappyhabits.com, and that link will be in the show notes too. And some of the most common resolutions that people make, which I'm sure you might be able to guess, at least half of the resolutions made are health related, which, it's like diet and exercise. I'm sure, some of you all listening to this, if you're making New Year's resolutions, that might be one of them or among them. And yeah, that's the most common, especially for Western cultures. And half of them are finance related. And if you're thinking, well, then that makes 100%. Well, it's not as if everyone gets one resolution. Half of all resolutions made, but people can make multiple resolutions, so that doesn't make up all of them. But yeah, about half of them made are health related, diet, exercise. You might see gym memberships. People get new gym memberships starting in January, and the gyms are all prepared for that. So they know to expect an influx of new memberships filling up the gyms. I mean, I know with COVID and stuff, things are a little bit different than they used to be, but yeah, the gyms would fill up. They'd be prepared for that load every year. And then after the first week, I think, I don't have that written down in my notes, but after the first week, maybe 75% of the influx is there. And then, by the second week, it's down to like less than 70%. And then after the first month, it's like 60%, if I remember correctly, so by mid-February, things have tapered down to close to normal levels. But yeah, there you go. Half health related, half finance related. And one thing to note that I have here from the article is that quitting smoking used to be the most popular resolution that people would make years ago, but now it's about 16% of resolutions. So it's not as popular as it used to be, probably because the culture's changed to where the biggest concern that people have is their own personal health related to physical activity and food, but smoking used to be the big vice. And, so maybe more people, it used to be a more common thing for people to smoke decades ago. But now, a lot of people today still smoke, but, those who smoke that are addicted to it probably like, I'm not going to make a resolution for that because I know for certain I'm not going to keep it. Do you have other ones, babe, for common resolutions?
A couple that I thought were interesting because I was looking at a site from Chris 6 News, and this was actually released on December 30th of 2021. And
like as in yesterday, as of this recording.
Yes. And so the 8th one on this list was spend time with family and friends. And then number 10 was read more, which I was like, okay, those are kind of cool ones because they're a little more outward focused. Like, okay, I'm going to focus on family and friends or learning more and increasing knowledge. So I thought those were kind of cool ones that I wouldn't have guessed on a top 10 list.
Yeah, because there are some things that you think people should make more rather than just your own personal health and stuff, which, are good things to do, but things like give more to charity or help people out or, things that are focused on others and stuff like that, like improving your morality towards other people. But yeah, in the secular society, there's a lot of focus on self, but I saw some from my article here, more common in Gen Z rather compared to other generations is, well, probably naturally because they're around that age, is, finding love, which I think is interesting because that depends on the willingness of someone else, to help you resolve it. And so that would kind of make me nervous, especially since people are more actively fulfilling their resolutions, in January or February, that finding love as a resolution, it would seem more like you're letting your guard down. To solve this, it might be a more flippant attitude toward things rather than trusting God, making sure that you're focused right and that someone who you find for love is someone who's committed to your good and so on like that. That would be more like a careless pursuit of fleeting love.
So statistically, I found that as many as 45% of people say that Americans say that they'll make a resolution, but only 8% actually successfully achieve them.
Yeah, so here we're getting into statistics about how well do people keep the resolutions that they make, because I mentioned before by around mid-February, those are related to gym memberships, they kind of fizzle down, in 2 months. And yeah, so the Discover Happy Habits article that I have, it says that around 30% of people surveyed plan to make resolutions. So it's not like 90%. It's, not everyone's willing to make a resolution. Apparently it's about close to a third of people actually want to make a resolution. And of those, about half keep some of their resolutions, and they might be the low-hanging fruit, like I resolved to reading a bit once a month, or something like that. Maybe the easiest ones are the ones that people keep. But according to what I have here, it's about 35% keep all their resolutions. But, somehow I'm like, okay, this is people surveyed. And if people are making resolutions that they're not going to keep, how many people are actually honest about whether they kept them all? So...
Plus, it'd be interesting to know if, when they did the study for if they kept the resolution or not. Because if they do the study 3 weeks out from when they made the resolution versus 3 months out from when they made it, those numbers could drastically be different. So it's kind of interesting. And what size of population they actually tested. Okay, was it just their small little 100-person gym that they asked that and they were able to keep it, or was it a survey that went out to millions of people in different states. It's hard to tell how accurate these numbers are, but I think in general, it seems like in what we hear is that it is difficult for people to actually keep their resolutions or follow through with the resolutions.
Yeah, because I would think that 8% figure is probably more accurate. So probably 8 to 10% of people, actually follow through with all their resolutions there. I did see on Finder.com an article there that said, as I would expect with the way COVID has changed things, and 2020 made people living at home and kind of changed their lives a bit unexpectedly, and then with 2021, that, okay, now there's about 15% more people this year from last year that are making resolutions. So after crawling through out of the, apocalypse here of COVID, that...
Did we crawl through it yet?
Oh, yeah, I know. Well, as people are kind of starting to get to some finding their own form of normalcy amidst everyone being subject to unknowns and stuff from the top down, it seems like some people now okay, this is how I was affected by COVID, how it affected my life. Now, there's more people are like, I'm going to resolve to doing this in 2022. And so, there's the resolutions are seeing a 15% increase for the next year here. Mm-hmm. But one thing, as we mentioned about how New Year's resolutions are more secular and stuff, and we see from these statistics about the failure rate to keep them, it also seems to correlate with the fact that these resolutions don't seem to be they don't have teeth to them. They're not covenants or vows or promises. No one's putting their hand on a Bible like in court and swearing to before God to keep their New Year's resolutions. They're more like just a motivational thing at the beginning, I'm planning to try to make this year a little bit better, and things fizzle out because they don't etch it in stone. They don't set a reminder on their phone that will remind them every week or every day or whatever. It's just, I remember now at the beginning of the year, and then as they get into the swing of things or life becomes hectic after the holidays and stuff, it's just oh, I forgot, so it's not really a strong thing, these New Year's resolutions, and once people don't keep them, it's well, I didn't really promise anything, it was just a hope,
Ecclesiastes chapter 4 verse 25. Therefore, laying aside falsehood, speak truth, each one of you with his neighbor, for we are members of one another for his name's sake.
What's up, everybody? I'm Jamal Bandy, the host of the Prescribed Truth podcast, where I seek to distribute the truth that the doctor prescribes to the church and the world today. The Lord graciously brought me out of a cult in 2010, saved me in 2013, and in 2017, Prescribed Truth began. My mission has been to spread the truth of God's word while refuting dangerous lies affecting most churches and the culture at large from a biblical and reformed perspective. Join me on Sundays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time for the live recording of the podcast on YouTube, and download the audio version wherever podcasts can be found, including the Christian podcast community. If you would like to know more about Prescribed Truth, please visit my website at prescribedtruth.com. And remember, this world is full of errors, but the only thing that the doctor prescribes is truth. Blessings.
But now let's think about, as Christians, since this is a Christian podcast with hopefully a mostly Christian audience, how should we as Christians think about New Year's resolutions? Are they something that Christians should participate in? And if we do, how do we Christianize them? And looking from the Word of God, what are some verses and so on? What are some principles that Christians can actually use and get a biblical perspective about New Year's resolutions, or even resolutions in general. How do we as Christians resolve to live the Christian life in light of the idea that we should resolve? So from the Christian perspective, and looking at the idea that people make pledges or even just resolutions and don't keep them, how should we think as Christians about saying something and following through with it? So from what I could see, from what I can glean from the Bible, and it should be intuitive to the Christian mind, we should keep our word. And so if we're going to keep our word, we should only give our word if we do plan to keep it. And so the principle from the Bible that we see is let your yea be yea and your nay be nay. And one example, the Apostle Paul was very careful to keep his word in such that he wouldn't give his word unless he is going to keep it. Because even something as simple as saying, I want to visit you. We see in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 17 and 18, look at part of verse 17, go to verse 18, it says, or the things that I purpose, do I purpose according to the flesh, that with me there should be yea, yea, and nay, nay? But as God is true, our word toward you was not yea and nay. Wait, why did he say that it wasn't yea and nay? But in context, Paul was talking about traveling to visit the Corinthians, and he knew that it wasn't going to be a certain thing. Now, he could have said, I really hope it really would be nice for me to visit, but he didn't want them to get their hopes up to expect him to come if Paul wasn't certain that he could keep his word. So rather than saying, I'm going to go visit you guys, and then have to apologize later to say, it could have been weather, we could have had shipwreck, something even perfectly legitimate that he could have said, I really planned to do this, but I was held back. But rather than do that and tell them, in a few months I'm going to come by and visit, Paul wasn't sure he would be able to visit the Corinthians, so he rather didn't tell them yea. He didn't want to, as he said, purpose according to the flesh. And I think that a lot of New Year's resolutions are purposing according to the flesh, like just flippantly, my flesh, I want to do this, so I'm going to say that I'm going to do it, but not really commit to doing it. And the biblical principle is let your yea be yea and nay, nay. So if you can't really do that, then don't say anything, is what the principle that the Apostle Paul gives.
Yeah, and I was looking at some examples in the Old Testament too. There are quite a few verses in Ecclesiastes, Numbers, Deuteronomy, where God's telling the people, don't make these promises that you can't keep. Like, don't say things and then you can't follow through. So it's better not to say you're going to do something, because then if you can't follow through in those verses, it's actually considered sin. But I think it was more like because they were making promises to God and promises to do something and weren't following through. But I'm kind of reminded too of, it's also not good, kind of what you're talking about with Paul and the Corinthians, not being vague about what you're going to do either.
Yeah.
And especially, I think when it comes to communication with your spouse, when you're having conversations with your kids or with other people, not being vague to where you're like, okay, maybe we can do this, or we'll see if we can do that. Because again, it's kind of like, oh, okay, I'm going to hold on to this hope that maybe means yes. And then if it doesn't work out, then you've let that person down. So it's, and also that maybe, or I'm not sure, it's really not fair to the person, because then they're kind of guessing like, okay, does that mean yes or does that mean no? And they're not really given that solid answer or direction. So I think that, I know that's one thing that I struggle with a lot, especially with the kids. And I just constantly try and remember, like, okay, try to be direct and tell them yes or no. And that gives them a little more security because they know for sure what's happening.
Yeah, good thoughts there, sweetheart, about, like as Christians, like it is easy to say things that you want to do, but then we got to keep in mind, like we want to make sure that people that hear us, our words of what we say we're going to do, we're going to carry them out and not like just lead them along and stuff, especially when Jesus would, like the woes on the Pharisees, Matthew 23 or Luke 11, I believe, where it's kind of humorous when you read it, but like the whole idea where it's like Jesus is giving the examples of the kinds of oaths people would make that the Pharisees would try to argue. And how does one violate the law or not violate the law with their oaths? And you'd have things like, okay, if you swear by the I swore by the temple, so you can't hold me accountable for it. But hey, if you swear by the gold in the temple, that binds you, and Jesus is trying to make the point. He talks about like, don't swear by the temple, don't swear by your head, I think it was. Don't swear by heaven because it's God's throne, or by earth because it's his footstool. I forget exactly the details there, but the point is, like, it doesn't matter what you're swearing by. It's the fact that you're swearing, because you don't get people to take your word and then you violate their trust by saying, well, I didn't swear by this, so I was able to give my word but not be held accountable for it. And I think the modern example would be like crossing your fingers and putting it behind your back, as if somehow just doing that gesture releases you from your word. Let your yea be yea and your nay be nay. And the point is, well, then you shouldn't have to be like terrified, like I have to make all these promises and oaths, and then now I've bound myself, like, but Jesus says, I tell you, swear not at all. Like if you can't keep a promise, don't make it in the first place. And there's some freedom to that. Now, we should strive to be better people, but we don't give our word to people unless we're prepared to do that. And the examples in the Bible about keeping the law, where it's like bind it around your neck, like because it's important that you keep this, make sure you never forget it. It needs to be every day bound on your head so that there's always a reminder, that it's there. Where if you look down, you see it, oh, it's there. I'm reminded to do this. And, so yeah, if you're going to make a promise, keep it. If you can't keep it, don't make a promise.
Don't you think, too, that I know you were mentioning earlier, not just kind of quickly and not thinking through your resolutions, just throwing stuff out there, but instead stepping back and looking at, okay, what is my motivation behind some of these resolutions I want to make? Is that self-serving? Yeah. Is it God-honoring? Also looking at like, okay, with this resolution, am I going to allow God to help me with this? Because that's where I can potentially fulfill it. Am I going to include other people to help me be accountable for it? And I think just taking it a little more seriously, and not that, oh, you have to have this whole like detailed plan and this is a serious matter, but more of, okay, when you do take it more seriously, you're more likely to accomplish that. And I think that helps people when they can see that they were able to accomplish these goals as well. And if you just have these huge, like, oh, I want to lose 50 pounds this next year. Yeah. You have no plan, you have no support people to encourage you on your journey, then most likely that's not going to happen. And then you get frustrated, like, oh man, I wanted to do this, I couldn't. So I think a little more preparation and prayer and just involving people around you. And just considering, okay, is this something that I can do? Having small goals, like, okay, maybe not 50 pounds, but all right, in the next few months, I want to try and get down 10 pounds and see, okay, I achieved that. In the next few months, let me try another 10, and making it achievable to where you can be successful in it. And it just reminds me of in Romans 7:18, where Paul is talking about like how he desires to do good, but he keeps failing. So
Yeah.
it's like, okay, a lot of times we desire to do good. We desire to do what's right. We want to improve our health and work on our Bible reading habits. And our desire a lot of times is to do good. But then we don't have that plan or that system set in place to where we can't actually follow through.
Definitely. So you are, and you mentioned like accountability, and so I know with a pastor at my church, I have a men's Bible study, and then a few weeks ago, I remember one of the chapters we're looking through in the book that's about men keeping their hearts pure. It had to do with accountability partners and stuff. So that's one of the things that are like key to that, where someone, a close friend, can like text you or call you up and ask, how are you doing? And then you got to be honest with it and stuff. So it's like that helps, if someone's like reminding you and you're reminding them, and that kind of accountability. If you're going to succeed with a New Year's resolution, it helps if someone else, if two are better than one, as the Bible says, and if you have an accountability partner, that can help with that too. But yeah, it's definitely important that you let your word be your bond if you make a word. And James 5:12 actually says, but above all things, my brethren, swear not, neither by heaven, neither by earth, neither by any other oath, but let your yea be yea and your nay, nay, lest you fall into condemnation or judgment there. And so James has just talked to the believers there and given them admonitions about different things, but he says, above all things, don't swear. It sounds like James, as well as Jesus to his disciples and condemning the Pharisees and the Apostle Paul, they all seem to think that giving your word is a very important thing. And so above all things, because it's a matter of truth. And as Jesus says, he's the way, the truth, and the life, truth is very important to the Christian. And so unlike the world where your word is flippant, with Christians, we should be careful to, we give our word, it's truth. And if we can't maintain truth, we should avoid giving our word. Ecclesiastes 5:2 says, be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. For God is in heaven, and thou upon earth. Therefore let thy words be few. So when I was looking at the article about New Year's resolution statistics, one of the excuses was too many resolutions, or even like that the goals were overly ambitious, which, when you say, as you mentioned, I'm planning to lose 50 pounds, or this year, that can impress your friends, whoa, that's quite the feat. But if you're going to be rash with it, it's not very impressive, and they wouldn't be really strong friends there if they're willing to keep sticking by your side with flippant promises that are overly ambitious, or making too many promises that you can't keep. And as the preacher, the wisest man who ever lived, even as he wrote Ecclesiastes from a solemn perspective of seeing all the vanity in the world, he says, therefore, after be not rash with your mouth, he says, therefore let your words be few. And so, keep that in mind for New Year's resolutions. Let your words be few. Well, that will bring us to the end of this episode, and we're going to do a two-parter here for New Year's resolutions. And the next part, the next episode, as you're possibly making your resolutions, maybe in the process of keeping some, hitting the gym or whatever, starting your diet plan, we're going to look at a Christian perspective on, should our resolutions just be thinking about this next year, or how should we view resolutions in regard to time? Should we just be thinking about yearly cycles, or should we be thinking about things that are permanent, things that are eternal? And some examples from the Bible about how we should resolve to change that as we're changed as Christians from the inside out by the gospel, and our lives should be a pattern after Christ, how our resolutions resolutions should be about permanent change. We'll look at verses that will guide us there. So stay tuned for the next episode of Truth Espresso as we conclude our two-part series about New Year's resolutions.
Thank you for waking up with Truth Espresso. Good morning, and God bless your day.
Hey friends, Daniel Minnick here again. If you liked waking up to this episode of Truth Espresso, I would really appreciate it if you would rate it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or whatever application you use to listen to Truth Espresso.